Hi everyone. Sorry I'm not showing my face today, but consider it a service to you because I've been sick and not looking my best. But by next week I'll be back on the screen. Today we are talking about using questions, which a lot of you have been waiting to get to this topic. And so I'm going to go through some ways to use questions and some pitfalls about using questions. So why do we use questions in counselling? Well, a lot of you have really wanted to use questions in your practice sessions because you found yourself getting stuck just using paraphrasing and reflection of feelings. And so intuitively, you know that by asking a question, you expand the conversation and get the client to elaborate on the topic. So you'd usually use a question to open a session. So you might ask what the person wants to talk about today or what brings them in to talk to you. You might use a question to invite the client to self-disclose, to talk about something about themselves. You might ask questions to focus the interactions, so to focus on a particular topic. Or to ask the person to elaborate on the topic, or to get richer information about the topic. Sometimes you must ask a question to shift to a new topic. So for example, if someone is going into a lot of detail about what someone else is doing, you might ask a question about, so how does this situation affect you? You might ask direct questions to assess someone in crisis or to assess suicide risk or self-harm risk. You might ask questions to point out the patterns between different stories or different problems that a client is telling you about. So you might use a question to point these out or to link them together. You could use a question to help people reflect on the meaning or to get some insight about the problem. And you can use them to help guide the client towards problem solving, but there is the right and the wrong way to do that. So first of all, one of the pitfalls of questions would be using a leading or assumptive question. So this is a question that expects a certain answer. So you've already made an assumption before you ask the question. So one example is, you don't take drugs, do you? So the problem with this kind of statement is you're really communicating to the client that you want them to say no. And we're not doing our job correctly if we ask a question in a way that doesn't allow us to actually find out the real information or the accurate information so we can help the person. Other assumptive questions, you aren't planning to kill yourself, are you? Now, I'll talk more about this when we're talking about suicide prevention, but the first step in suicide prevention is to understand whether someone's at risk or not. And asking this kind of question in this kind of way means that we're not going to get that answer, so we can't help someone. Questions like, are you anxious about that? On the face of it, that question looks okay, but it is suggesting to the client that they probably should feel anxious about that. So we might want to make that more of an open question, such as, how are you feeling about that? Again, something like, are you going to tell your mother about the failed grade, suggests that they should tell their mother about the failed grade. So are you thinking of leaving your partner? Then suggests that perhaps they should be thinking about leaving their partner. So again, we need to remove the assumption from the questions and make it more of an open question. So that last one could be something like, so what are your thoughts about what you might do next? So another pitfall that is very common when asking questions is asking multiple questions or layered questions. So here's an example. The client: I don't remember anything that happened after I got to the party. Counsellor: what do you remember? Were you there all evening? What's the last thing you remember? How much did you drink? So these kinds of questions leave the client feeling a bit overwhelmed or helpless or stupid if they don't know which question to ask first. Well, they might try and answer all the questions, or they might not be able to answer any of them. And so we need to make it easier for the client by just asking one question at a time. So when you find yourself doing it, and you will find yourself doing it, just pause and rephrase the question to make sure it's not layered. Another pitfall are why questions or judgmental questions. And we've talked about why we need to avoid judgment and being judgmental with clients. And they certainly face enough criticism in their real lives about their decisions or behaviour or whatever it is. They don't need it from us as well. So we need to make sure that the way we phrase things doesn't suggest judgment. And why, unfortunately, why can often suggest that we should not have done something or should not feel a certain way. So why did you do that? Well, the alternative is, how did you decide what to do at that point? Or what happened then? Client: people don't seem to like me. Why? Can you tell me more about that? Is an example of an alternative. Or could you give me an example of when that happens? Another pitfall are advice giving questions or suggestive questions. And that's where we're kind of hiding advice or judgment, and it's disguised as a question. So these tend to start with, don't you think, or could you, or couldn't you, or have you tried? And this often happens when you start to feel a bit nervous or stuck with a client, and you might start to talk about, have you tried yoga to relax? Or have you tried making a list of all the things you need to do? Or have you tried just not drinking? You know, that kind of thing. So the problem with this is the client will often take the question as suggesting that course of action. And as we know, when we give advice, it's not often the right advice, because it's based on our own context and our own values and our own experiences, and not the client's. And it's much more effective to help the client come to this themselves, because they're the experts in their own life. It's common in beginning counsellors who really want to help their clients, so it's coming from a good place often. And when you're anxious about your performance. So common ones are, have you tried meditation for your anxiety? Have you thought about trying to go on a diet? Why don't you try going to the party and see how it goes? Why don't you try thinking of other things? So, I mean, all of these strategies could be good strategies, but they need to be broached and discussed in a way that's not you giving advice. It's about exploring the options with the client. So one of the most important things to know about asking questions is that we, most of the time, want to be asking open questions. Closed questions are questions that have a yes or a no, or one or another answer. So they tend to close down the conversation, and there's not much opportunity for the client to elaborate. And so sometimes we might use these to clarify information or to slow the client down if they're on a bit of a monologue, or to help give the client focus or to make an assessment. But most of the time you want to be using open questions. So here's some examples. Do you like your mother? Well, the answer to that, it could be yes or no, I guess. And an open way of asking that, how do you feel about your mother? Did you grow up here? Well, there's only, usually one or two answers for that one. Where did you grow up? Gives the client an opportunity to tell you, but also tell you a little bit about it. Did you like school? What were your years like in high school? That's much more of an invitation for them to tell you about their experience. Do you have a best friend? Well, for example, that's another kind of, I suppose, an assumptive question, because it assumes that someone maybe should have a best friend, whereas that's not necessarily the case. So another way to phrase that would be, what can you tell me about your friendships? Do you like to read? What are some of your hobbies? Did you ask him about that? What did you say after that? Were you upset? What was that like for you? So you can see that turning something into an open question, you're often starting the sentence with a how or a where or a what. And that usually indicates that it's an open question, whereas a closed question often starts with a do or a did or a were. So here are some examples of beginnings of open questions. So these beginnings give the client the freedom to respond in lots of different ways. So you're not leading them in a certain direction, which provides a client that sense of ownership and authorship of the session, of their story. And it also creates that space for the client to say more about the problem. So can you tell me more about that? Is a great one for inviting them to expand. What do you think that was all about? That's a good question to ask someone if you're wanting to get to what's bothering them about the situation, or what are they finding difficult about it, or what's their take on the situation, without putting your own judgments on it. What did you think about that? And how do you make sense of that? So when you're talking about someone who had a bad reaction to something, or got very angry or very upset, how do you make sense of that? Or a relationship breakdown, how do you make sense of that? Tell me your thoughts about that. What else is a really good one too, if you feel like there's more to the story? So closed questions. Was the lecture good or bad? Tell me how you found the lecture today. Did you have a good week? Tell me about your week. Did you feel bad about that? What came up for you about that? Or what do you feel about that? Do you want to get married? What are your thoughts or feelings about getting married? Tell me more about that. So we need to keep our questions tentative as well, which invites the client to correct us or to give us feedback. It's helpful in helping the client explore. It's not promoting ourselves as the expert on the client. It also models to the client that it's okay to be uncertain, and that's very important modeling, because sometimes clients can be very hard on themselves. So it's great to be able to model the fact that we're okay with not knowing everything, and models how to check out uncertainties in a respectful way. So a way to do tentative questioning. Sometimes you might want to blend this with a feeling reflection or an empathic statement. So I wonder What comes up for you when you think about a separation? So that's asking the person to talk about how they're feeling, but in a tentative way, in a gentle way. I'm wondering if there's any sadness about that. I would imagine you're feeling excited and nervous at the same time. Am I on the right track here? I wonder how it is for you when she doesn't return your call time after time. You can see there's a much more open and gentle way of asking people how they're feeling. So there are other questions that we can use for specific purposes. And the first one is a transitional question. So that's where you draw on something that the client has touched on before and you check back in about that now, or you create a link between that topic that the client was talking about before and the topic they're talking about now. Choice questions. So we always want to give the client the choice where possible. Would you like to continue talking or leave it there for now? Or, if a client alludes to something, something traumatic or something they feel ashamed about, we want to be careful not to push them to disclose this, because what happens is if a client discloses something before they're ready, often there's a great sense of shame afterwards, and you might find that they are reluctant to talk to you again because they feel ashamed. And so we want to give people the choice. So if they allude to something, you can say, so you mentioned, there's a secret that you don't tell anyone. Is that something you want to share today or later when you feel more comfortable? The advice question. So this is a really good one. So often we treat ourselves much, much worse than we treat the people around us, and we're a lot harsher on ourselves. And so you can ask the advice question. So if your sister was feeling the same way, what would you say to them? Because it helps give that client the perspective that they wouldn't actually be giving the same harsh, punitive advice to their sister if she was in the same situation as they are to themselves. So it gives that bit of perspective and that bit of distance so they can see that perhaps they're being a bit hard on themselves. And maybe there's a kinder way of dealing with it. Miracle questions. So this is where you ask someone, if you woke up tomorrow and a miracle had happened, with everything was solved, what would life be like? And that's where you really get a sense of how do they want to be living their life, what values do they have, and how do they see their future. And that's really good when people don't have a goal, or they don't have a sense of, or they're very rooted in problems and what's wrong now, and they can't really see what they're aiming for. And similarly, the goal-oriented questions, that's where you can get someone to really pinpoint, so how do we know if things are getting better? How will you know if this counselling is working? Or how will you know if you're feeling better? Because it's very subjective, obviously. Well, I'll be able to get up to go to work every day, or I'll be able to participate in my friendship groups, or I'll be able to join family dinners without getting upset, those kinds of things. And scaling questions. So on a scale of 1 to 10, how bad is the pain right now? And that's a really good way of gauging how much the client is suffering and how difficult something is. And it's a good way of checking back in as to how things are improving. We also use scaling questions when we're talking about making changes, and I'll talk to you about that more when we are talking about changing behaviour. So as useful as questions are to propel the session forward and to get more information and to give the client the invitation to explore, questions can be abused. So often new counsellors find it tempting to use questions when they're not required, or they really hurt their brains trying to come up with the best kinds of questions, when really, most of the time, just a very open question, what's that like for you, can be enough. Or just a simple paraphrase is enough. So you need to do less than you think when we're counselling. So it's important to remember that and to try to not leap in with a question every time there's a pause. Think about, am I reflecting back to the client to show I'm hearing them, rather than trying to come up with a really clever question. Using too many questions can control the session, control the direction of the session. So they might stop exploring their own world and instead just wait for your next question. So it becomes like a question and answer session, which defeats the purpose of what we're trying to do. The other thing is we need to be careful not to ask questions for our own interest. So sometimes someone will be telling you a story. For example, I am building a house, and I had a client telling me about starting the process of building a house, and naturally, so we've got a shared experience there. There's some kind of interest about her experience of that, but that's outside of my professional role. And so I need to be careful not to ask questions around someone's experience just because I want to know something, just because I'm curious. There always needs to be a purpose to our questions. Is there, are we helping someone with the question, or are we satisfying our own curiosity? Because if we're satisfying our own curiosity, that falls outside of ethical behaviour. So be mindful of, am I asking this question for me or for them? And it should always be for them. So sometimes clients want to be told what to do. So often it's best, I mean, it's easy, it would be easy just to say, well, I think you should, choose maths instead of science, for example. But really, it's best to deflect the question back to them so they can explore their options. So your job is to help them explore their options. So client, whenever I get to class, I go blank. What should I do? Should I quit? Counsellor. Well, they could say, yeah, you should quit. It obviously sounds too much for you, overwhelming. Or you could say, what would that mean for you? So that invites the client to explore what would be the consequences of quitting. How would they feel about that? Or other options to deal with this feeling of going blank. When someone's asking simple questions, of course, just answer them. So we don't want to tie ourselves in knots trying to avoid answering a question. But we also don't want to take the easy route of just giving someone advice when they're asking for it. Sometimes clients will also ask you questions about yourself. And, if it's very kind of impersonal, then you can answer it very, very briefly. But sometimes you'll find, so maybe they'll say, so do you live nearby? And you can kind of broadly say, well, I live in the general Fremantle area. So do you live with your family? And so at that point, that's perhaps getting into too personal a territory, and you could say something like, you know, I'd love to talk about me, but I'm really aware that we're here for you, and so let's focus on what you need from me. So you can identify these pitfalls here. How did you figure this would possibly work? Now that's pretty judgmental, isn't it? It suggests that they're crazy for thinking it could work. Why didn't you ask her to come with you? Well, that's a why question. So it's suggesting that they should have asked her to come with you. Was that the right thing to do? Well, that's a closed question. So it's got a yes or no answer, but it's also got a judgment in there too. It suggests that it wasn't the right thing to do. And that's an easy one to fall into. Was that the right thing to do? Or do you regret that? Or that kind of thing. But yeah, be careful of those kinds of questions that have the judgment attached. Do you like your father? Well, that's another closed question. You were taking drugs? That's a closed question, but it's also an assumptive question. Where are you going with this story? Well, that's just a horrible question, isn't it? So, there's other ways you can phrase that. And possibly a better way of doing that would be just to kind of summarize what the client has said up until this point and ask them, so what's the most important part of this story for you? What's the most difficult part of this for you? Have you tried going to bed earlier? Well, that's an advice question. And you don't know about the person's circadian rhythms and, that kind of thing. And you don't know what responsibilities they have in the evening, and they might have tried that a million times before. And so it's just going to disrupt that alliance if you're giving them advice of things that doesn't truly understand the nature of their problem. Did you like the job, and who got you into the physics anyway? And how old were you when you graduated? Well, that's a layered question. So which part of that do they answer first? So you could break that down into, so tell me about how you got into physics. And so now I would like you to have a look at the video on Blackboard, and that shows an example of a counsellor using paraphrasing, reflections of feeling, and questions. So you can see how they all come together to create a more well-rounded and a more in-depth session for your practice sessions. Thanks for your attention.